Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Natalia, and I am a business development manager for WSET's new beer qualifications. For those of you who may not be familiar with WSET, the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, we have been delivering qualifications in wine, spirits, sake, and now beer for the last 55 years. And we've been delivering them to both professionals and to enthusiasts all around the world. Today, you can take one of our qualifications in over 70 different countries through our 800 different course providers. So if you're curious to start your WSET journey, go ahead and go to wsetglobal.com and you can look for a course provider near you to get started. Just a few little notes about today's session before we get into it. This webinar is going to be recorded, so you can watch back on the WSET Global Events Hub on YouTube. And also, we welcome questions throughout. But please remember, use the chat to say hello, use the Q&A box that you'll find on the bottom of your screen to share your questions there. So all questions, submit them at any time throughout the session into that Q&A box specifically. That's all the housekeeping, so let me introduce you to our speaker for this session. The session is called Lager, How the World's Favorite Beer is More Varied Than You Think, and we have Mark Dredge as our host for this session. Mark is a James Beard Award-winning writer, and he's based on the south coast of England. You might recognize him as the beer expert from Channel 4's Sunday Brunch. He's also an international beer judge, has developed a really wonderful series of beer flavor wheels to help with tasting training, and he's written 9 books about beer, including one of my personal favorites that I have here, A Brief History of Lager. You can see all of my post-it notes that I've got down here. This is a very well-read copy, and it's an absolutely wonderful book. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, in this session, you're going to get to hear some snippets and stories all about lager and just how diverse it really is. So I'm going to hand on over to Mark, take us through the session. So looking forward to it. Thank you for being here.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone else who is attending. Yes, my name is Mark Dredge. I am a beer writer. That said, I've written a bunch of books about beer, including a book about lager, which I think is my favorite book of all the ones that I have written. I wrote it in 2018 and 2019. It took me around the world trying to essentially understand what made lager the most popular beer in the world. That's kind of the tagline of the book, the world's favorite beer. And I think if you think about beer, anywhere you go in the world, if you say, I would like a beer, you are almost certainly going to be handed a lager. Something cold, something fizzy, something light, something refreshing. I wanted to understand how that came to be. I wanted to understand what made lager the beer that transcended and traveled the world and kind of see this full journey. And I'm going to give you, I mean, my book was called The Brief History of Lager. I'm going to give you the very, very, very brief history of that. And I'm going to do it via around about 10 different beer styles to kind of give you the idea of where these beer styles came from. Like Nat said, please put all of your questions in. I won't take questions through this. I'm just going to try and sort of whiz through 10 different beer styles and some of my favorite stories through lager's history. But then I'm going to have plenty of time at the end, hopefully, to be able to answer any questions, whether that's about flavor, story, process, whatever you like. I'm here to answer it. Okay, so let's go through some of these slides. So this is my book. This is sort of the nicer looking version of it. This is like the render to make it look nice. It's actually, there's not many copies of this available. I do have some which I can sell directly. I don't want this to be like a sales pitch because I'm not here for that, but you can get it from my website, which is Beer Dredge. Dredge is in my surname. But lager. So I think I'm going to start at the beginning, and then I'm going to start at the end, I suppose, actually, and go all the way back to the beginning. I think this is what the world sees lager as today. It's very much a social drink. It's very much a simple drink. It's a beer that is heavily marketed. You know, Budweiser, one of the best-selling beers in the world. You know, every mainstream lager has this incredible machine of marketing behind it. And that means that for most drinkers, it's not necessarily seen as delicious. It's just seen as ubiquitous. For some people, it's a holiday beer. It's this thing that they drink and they absolutely love in the sunshine. It's this most absolutely refreshing drink that there is. And then there's still this sort of nice link to the heritage in Germany and in Central Europe. So I think even from the outside, whether whatever your knowledge is of beer or of lager, there is lots to lager. Um, but I think a lot of the variety, a lot of the excitement, a lot of the breadth and depth of lager isn't really that well known. Um, and that was what I really wanted to explore when putting together this book. And I'm going to kind of go into some of those details as we talk through essentially the evolution of lager styles. And for me, essentially, this evolution is sort of 600 years of refinement. It's sort of refining this product that was brewed 600 or 700 years ago, very localized in Upper Bavaria. It was a dark beer. It was probably sweet, probably a bit rough, and how that refined over many, many years into what we have now. And there's some cool stories along the way. Um, all right, let's jump right in. For me, this is just a quick indicative slide of what brewing may have been like, say, 500, 600, 700 years ago. The slide on the left, very much rudimental early brewing, but this was kind of showing beer as it was becoming actually a little bit more industrial. So this was sort of the beginning of brewing for larger volume. So over direct fire, probably in a copper pan, warming it up, and then it would have been transferred over into barrels, and then it would have been matured or fermented and then matured until it was ready to drink. With ale, that would have happened very quickly. So you would have fermented it, you would have stored it for maybe even just a few days, and then it would have been gone out and it would have been ready to be drunk. The reason it was done quite quickly is because it was very hard to control fermentation and to control yeast and wild bacteria. And particularly in warmer months and in warmer weather, that bacteria was going to make it go sour very quickly. So for a lot of history, beer was something that was brewed and drunk quite quickly. There are exceptions to that, and Porter and India Pale Ale are great examples of beer that was matured in great industrious quantities, but that didn't come until the 1800s. What separated lager and what made lager completely unique is that upon the point of filling up these barrels, so wooden barrels, what the brewers in Upper Bavaria did, so we're talking sort of the middle of Germany, down to sort of around the Munich area, they stored those barrels in cold cellars or caves. So this is sort of a modern version of what that cellar may have looked like. Um, but they either dug down underneath, say, a small brewery, into sort of a house's cellar, effectively. So they would have stored beer there. Or if there was a hillside, they would have dug a cave down into that hillside, rolled the barrels down into that cave, and matured it. Um, and I'm sure lots of people know this story already, but the name lager comes from the German word for to store. So it was beer that was stored, not beer that was drunk fresh. The beauty, the benefit of putting it into cold cellars is that it lasted a bit longer. It's just like modern refrigeration. You put something in that fridge, it's going to last longer. It's not going to go off so quickly. And what the brewers found was that this beer was able to last for many weeks, even months, potentially even years inside these cooler cellars. Um, and this gave us essentially the process of lager brewing, sort of the earliest origins of what we had as a lager product and as a unique, distinct lager product. I'm going to jump forward slightly in history to sort of see where that evolution went to. And these are ideas of what a brewery would have looked like in the 1800s. So the image on the left, that's not actually a brewery, but it's essentially what it would have looked like. The one on the right clearly is a brewery, and it would have been done in layers. The top level that you see there is actually ice. So while cellars were naturally cold, brewers wanted to make them colder. So they would harvest ice and they would store that ice in the top of the brewery. The middle layer would be where fermentation is. So fermentation naturally happens at a warmer temperature than maturation or lagering. And then in the bottom, you've got your lagering cellars, and that's where your beer is being matured. What would then happen when the beer is ready is those giant barrels in the bottom will be rolled out to the top. They will be filled into smaller wooden barrels and delivered to pubs. So it's kind of the essence, the origin of sort of where lager brewing came from before industrialization. And actually, one of the things that really stuck out to me when I was writing this book was how industrialization was significant throughout the history of lager brewing. Um, and whenever we see new jumps and new changes in styles, it was always a combination of industry, technology, science, like probably all three of those together, but also some kind of social context. So we're going to talk through a bunch of different beer styles, and each of them came because of those, yeah, those different needs, whether it was the industry and technology or society wanting different things. They came together and they made these changes. I haven't got the time to go into the details of all of that for each of these beer styles, but where relevant, I'll definitely mention it. Okay, so if you want to know what the earliest lagers tasted like, then you need to try a Rauchbier. I kind of asked this later on when I'm kind of not in webinar mode, but if anyone's had a Rauchbier or a smoked beer, then they are incredibly distinctive. The picture on the left is from a brewery called Schlenkerla, or that's what the tavern is known as, Schlenkerla. In Bamberg. Bamberg, if you want to drink the world's best lagers and the most diverse quality and quantity of lager in the world, go to Bamberg. It's a dark lager. It's quite rich. It's quite sweet. It's 5 or so percent, but it's very, very smoky. And the smoke, if you look from the image on the right, is because during the malting process, wood is used. So wood is used directly, I should say. So wood is going into the fire, and the smoke from that wood is directly malting the grain. I'll mention this in a little bit, but when the technology existed to do this indirectly, which was around the 1800s, the flavor of smoke essentially disappeared from beer. Now, if you think beer has 10,000 plus years of history, we can pretty much assume that for almost 10,000 years, beer had a smoky edge to it. It had this smoky flavor to it because it was quite hard to indirectly malt your grain without fire. The only other way to do it was just in the sun, which wasn't really that practical. So we have this great might not be the right word, depending on how you like this beer style, but we have this really intense flavor. One of the benefits of lagering was actually that by leaving it in the cold for several weeks or months, it actually mellowed some of that smoky flavor and actually took it away. One of the interesting things I think about smoke is that it was actually kind of a seasoning. So the diets 500-600 years ago were not necessarily that diverse. It was maybe bread and meat and not that much else to it, but actually a glass of quite sweet, quite smoky beer added an element of flavor to fairly bland diets. Also, I think what's interesting in this image is they're still serving it in a very historic way. And Schlenkerla in Bamberg is one of those perfect examples of how lager brewing used to be. So this tavern in the middle of town used to be a brewery. They used to mature their beer there until they got a bit bigger. Then they moved about 200 meters up the road where there's a hill, and they dug their brewery into that hill, and that brewery is still underground right now. So all the brewing, all of the kind of maturing of beer happens underground. So we have this intense, unique flavor of Rauchbier. Okay, Bock and Doppelbock I'll talk about next. We have some monks here. If you've heard of Doppelbock, then there's a good chance that you've heard of the story of monks who drank beer as a fast. So sort of during their Lenten fast, they would drink beer to sort of sustain themselves. That is almost certainly not the exact story, but it's one of beer's most interesting stories nonetheless. But actually, what I think here is more relevant to talk about is that there were brewing seasons. So we have winter beer and summer beer, and beer could only be brewed between the end of September and the end of April. And we're talking specifically about Bavaria here, though generally around the world, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, these brewing seasons existed. So people did not brew beer during the summer. So you could brew beer end of September, end of March. The beer that was brewed and drunk in the winter was called winter beer. So it may have been brewed, let's say, in December, and you could have drunk it in February. The beer that was brewed in the winter, but then drunk and saved and drunk in the summer was known as summer beer. Summer beer was slightly more expensive, it was slightly stronger, it was slightly richer, and it was slightly more bitter. But you have this differentiation between, I guess, beer seasons. But there wasn't necessarily diversity in style. Every brewery, and bear in mind every brewery was very small, every brewery would have done things slightly differently. So there would have been variety in taste. But beer was really just beer. You went to a place, you went to a tavern, and you just ordered the beer that was there. Um, but already we started to see in the maybe the 15, 16, 1700s seasonal variation come into it. And this is where Bock and Doppelbock come in. So these were slightly stronger beers. So these would have been linked into those change in beer seasons. So there would have been this element of celebration that would have come at the beginning of a new season. So you would have had this Bock beer and this Doppelbock beer, which is an even stronger version, would have come during the changing of those seasons. Um, what we know about those styles today is that they are richer, they are sweeter. Um, we often talk about them as being liquid bread because they have this sort of weight to them, certainly a caloric weight as well as kind of a sweetness weight. That would have been even more true hundreds of years ago when these beers were coming out. They were brewed to be very, very sweet, very, very nourishing. And that's kind of part of the idea of where this story came in of monks drinking it to sustain themselves during their fast. It seems to be just sort of a convenient overlap of stories that gives us that. But yeah, I can maybe go into a bit more detail on that later. But it's a nice story. But we start to see here some variation. Then we move into an evolution of lager into what becomes sort of more standardized kinds of lager around Central Europe. So we're now talking about still primarily Bavaria, but there is some reach into the Czech Republic as well. Um, Again, these beers are not necessarily called Dunkel at this point because there is no alternative. This is just the beer. It's just the beer is dark because that's how it is. That's how it's made. The reason it's dark is because of that indirect malting, changing the color of changing the color of the malt through that process, making a darker beer. The one on the left is Hopperhaus in Munich, absolutely classic. That has an incredible history that is, I mean, I could do an hour-long version of this talk on just the Hofbrauhaus and its importance. But more recently, there was one story, one element of lager's history, which I couldn't find an answer to in the book because the research hadn't kind of come up to date with it yet. But it was essentially where lager yeast actually came from. So this is obviously an incredibly important part of lager's story, and it was not known until maybe a couple of years ago how lager yeast properly and ultimately evolved. But the current hypothesis and the current belief is that it happened in what's now the Hofbrauhaus in the early 1600s. And again, there's quite a long story to that. If you want to read that story, I wrote an article about it for a publisher called Good Beer Hunting. So if you search lager yeast, my name, Good Beer Hunting, you'll be able to find out more about that. But essentially, it's the origin of lager yeast's story. One other quick story while we're here on Czech lager. So I showed you those pictures earlier of the breweries maturing the beer in their own cellars. So they're brewing it, leaving it in underground in the brewery, sending out to pubs when the beer is ready. In the Czech Republic and around Prague, it was actually the role of the publican to mature their beer. So essentially the brewery would have fermented their beer, put it into a barrel, and then they would have taken that barrel of very fresh beer to the tavern, and then that tavern would store it in their own cellars until they decided that it was ready. Which I think is a pretty cool story. Right, I need to move on because I've got lots of more beer styles to go through in the next few minutes. This is another one of my favorite stories because these three guys on the left, I don't know if they chose to pose this way or asked to pose this way or or whatever it was, but these are three prominent Central European brewers or the sons of prominent brewers. So we've got Sedlmayr from Munich. On the right is a picture of his brewery in Munich in the 1840s. So we're not talking massive breweries. So here's the guy on the left. One in the middle is Dreyer, so a Vienna brewer, and the one on the right is a Lederer, a brewer from Nuremberg. 1840s, lager is still small scale in Bavaria, still pretty much a rudimentary process. But these three brewers traveled around the UK to learn more about industrialization of brewing. They learned about how to brew in bigger scale. They learned about um, managing yeast. They learned about things like the thermometer, the saccharometer, ways to essentially measure how to brew beer and how to make it better, and ultimately, and importantly, make it more consistently. What happened was Sedelmeier, the guy on the left, he went back to Munich and he essentially perfected his dark lager brewing recipe and his process over a couple of years. He evolved it and was able to make much better beer much more consistently. And this was late 1830s, early 1840s. We can pinpoint that as essentially, I would say, the modern birth of lager. So all modern lager ultimately comes from this point, this evolution, this sort of this cut in time where we went from sort of not really knowing exactly how beer was brewed and exactly how to make it properly and how to make it consistently into having much more control over it. The chap in the middle, Dreyer, from Vienna, he developed his own type of beer, which became known as Vienna Lager. So this is an image of what his brewery came to look like, absolutely massive. We can imagine that his beer was something like the color of the one on the right, this sort of rich, dark amber color. The significance here is that they're using indirect malting. So they're starting to use techniques which give paler beer. So we're no longer just having very dark beer. We're moving into into these paler qualities of beer. And these two brewers, so the Munich's dark lager and Vienna's amber lager, they started to travel and they started to actually move out of just their very localized regions into new places. And one of the most important places they ended up was Pilsen in the Czech Republic. So Pilsner, perhaps one of the best known beer styles in the world. Um, it's the name and the place and the origin of golden lager. Well, that's certainly the story that is told. They talk about the beer as being the world's first golden lager, brewed in 1842. Actually, we have the exact date. It's the 5th of October, 1842. The very first Pilsner was brewed, and it was drunk 5 or 6 weeks later. Um, there are definitely stories from 10 or 20 years earlier of pale lagers being drunk in Munich, but this is the story that has stuck. What they did was they took all of that great knowledge that had evolved in the past couple of years, and then they made the beer even lighter. The beauty of Pilsen is that it has incredibly soft water. So it actually meant that brewing paler beers was more possible. There's the complex water chemistry and the chemistry of the compounds in malt mean that Munich's water was naturally better suited to brewing darker beers, whereas Pilsen's soft water was naturally better for brewing paler beers. But we had this revolutionary new pale lager and this new pale beer. And these three types of beer, actually, what ultimately happened is the Vienna lager was forgotten because this new Pilsner overtook it very quickly. And pale lagers were actually brewed in Vienna very, very quickly. But these types of beers began to travel the world. So dark lagers and pale lagers, they started to spread. So you had this type of beer that was very localized in Bavaria and into the Czech Republic, and Pilsen is not that far from the border with Bavaria. They were very localized in the 1840s. By 1860s, 1870s, it's becoming a much more global drink, and it's through ultimately Pilsner more than anything else. The next great leap in lager brewing happens in the US. So we often think, there's jokes about how, about American lager, or how watery it is, how bland it is, but actually it was incredibly significant in the whole history of lager brewing. And almost all of the industrial developments that makes lager the drink it is today happened with large American brewers. Um, Anheuser-Busch is, and Budweiser is the most famous, arguably. But they're also one of the most pioneering. And in terms of pioneering, what they were doing is they were some of the first brewers to bring in all sorts of really important technologies. Artificial refrigeration. So the benefit of artificial refrigeration is you can brew lager anywhere. You no longer have to go underground, and you can brew at any time. We no longer have to abide by brewing seasons. They brought in mass bottling. So you could then fill loads and loads of bottles instead of just having barrels that you could only serve locally. They used mass transportation, so they could send beer all over the world. Pasteurization, so that beer was safe when it traveled, for 2 or 3 months. So they completely changed it. What happened though is that the earliest recipes that arrived into the US, let's say the 1850s, they were Bavarian recipes. They were sweet, they were rich, they were fairly low in alcohol. Actually, that's something I probably haven't mentioned yet, is that almost all the time through history, with a few exceptions, lager is very low in alcohol, so maybe only 3%. This is not a strong beer. This is also probably not a beer that you're drinking to get drunk. If you want to get drunk, you're drinking schnapps, you're drinking hard liquor. You're drinking beer because it's this nourishing, refreshing drink. It also has this caloric element, this liquid bread sort of flavor element to it. As this beer spread around America, American drinkers, they weren't interested. They were drinking hard liquor, they were drinking whiskey. But something changed in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and the taste changed, and Americans wanted to drink beer. They wanted something that was more refreshing, that wasn't just going to get them absolutely wasted. And beer became that drink. Um, but the Bavarian beers were seen as too rich, too sweet, you know, too heavy. So the brewers started making them lighter. And to do that, they added corn and rice. So they added these adjuncts, expensive adjuncts that were very complicated to brew with, but they added these and they ended up brewing beers that were much lighter in quality, and in character, and therefore more refreshing. And they suited this new need of the consumer who wanted to actually go out and sit with friends and drink a couple of beers, not see beer as this sort of accompaniment to dinner that was extra nourishment and nutrition as they were going. And I think the significance also here is that lager has spread to the US. US brewers have got enormous. When new breweries are then opening in the rest of the world, they are being inspired by American brewers. They are no longer being inspired by the old sort of hegemony of British brewing, British porters and ales and things. They're being inspired by American brewers. So when you go to South America, when you go to Asia, the brewers that are opening as lager breweries because they now have the ability to brew in any climate, anywhere in the world. And people come to want this lighter, more refreshing, and ultimately more consistent drink. All of the things that have been put in place by the American brewers have led to this drink being very knowable and very consistent. One quick sort of side note back to London, because lager did spread into London. This is Piccadilly Circus. So if you have ever been in Piccadilly Circus, this is a very familiar sight. The sign at the top and the sign above the door says Spartan beer. That is Sedelmeier, the guy that we saw standing with his mates earlier on. That big building there used to have a big beer hall in the cellar selling Spartan beer. So, and there were several other breweries in London that were making lager. So we see this spread everywhere, even in the kind of the sort of ale dominant areas in ale dominant countries. Then we come to Helles. So it's now arguably the most common lager style, maybe, or the lager style that has been most appropriated or copied around the world. But it took Munich's brewers a long time to get to this. So Munich's brewers started out with their dark beers, and they were very, very resistant to change. So by the late 1800s, pale lager is brewed almost all over the world, but it's not brewed in Munich. And it wasn't brewed there until the late 1890s. And there's great stories about revolution and fights among the brewers and the Brewers Guild because they didn't want to do it. But they eventually started brewing paler beers and they took over. So again, it's part of this refinement, I think, and this idea of wanting refreshment and light and clean and crisp. The darker lagers just don't have that in the same way. They have more malt flavor, they have more richness, they have more depth. Whereas these Helles, which means pale compared to the dark Dunkel, they just have that lighter character to them. Actually, one thing which I didn't mention, which is probably relevant flavor-wise, is when we're talking about Pilsner, we have classic Czech Pilsners, and they tend to be richer and a bit sweeter and fuller bodied. As those styles traveled, I talked about the American ones. They got very light, very low in bitterness, very low in character and flavor, ultimately. And then we have German Pilsners, which were much more snappy, lean, dry, bitter. So you have this sort of differentiation of pilsners around the world. And that leads us into sort of where beer is going now. So we've seen this great history, we've seen this great evolution of styles, and we're now seeing modern evolution of those styles into new lager types. So the one on the left, Tipo Pils, and it's known as an Italian Pilsner. It's a German dry hopped style lager, as in the hops you use are German and it's dry hopped. The beer in the middle, Holdout, this is, I mean, it doesn't look like much, but this is about a 6% IPA style lager. So it's brewed like it's hopped like an IPA, but it drinks like a lager. And then the brewery like Notch on the right, they're brewing absolutely classic versions of these famous old styles, these Czech style lagers, kind of regional German varieties. So we've then got this new brilliant interest in lager and lager variation. You know, it's no longer just this one type of drink that is cold and fizzy and yellow. And yes, I know that all three of these are cold and fizzy and yellow, but taste these three beers side by side, and you wouldn't believe that they were necessarily in the same family of beers. Right. I've tried to fly through 30-minute history of lager via what I see as perhaps the most important lager styles today, or lager styles throughout history. So, yes, thank you for listening, and I am here to answer any questions that may have come through.
Thank you so much, Mark. Gosh, that was a lot crammed into a very little period of time, but it's really brought us up to where the world of beer is today. We've had folks joining us from so many different countries, from the UK, the US, Switzerland, Hungary, Guatemala, Poland,
Wow.
Portugal, Germany. And we have Julia in the chat has very kindly shared the link that you suggested to your Good Beer Hunting piece. So
Oh,
folks
great.
want to read a bit more about the role of Hofbrauhaus in the history of lager yeast. We just have one question from Karen. And Karen, be prepared for a new flavor experience coming through. Oh, we've got another question from David, which I'll add in a bit, but this one from Karen. Are there any breweries that still do the old-fashioned brewing of Rauchbier? So for folks who want a taste of history, how do they find it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, the best place to go is to Bamberg because it's seen as this center of Rauchbier and smoked beer brewing. But actually, there are only two breweries there that brew that all the time. But Schlenkerla, the example that I showed on screen, they still brew it. They still brew it in the town, and it's a phenomenal experience to try that locally. Um, it's also a style that lots of brewers make around the world, so they want to try and make their own version of that. And they do it in different ways. Um, they do it in different styles. But the classic and the one to really try is the Schlenkerla one. It's the most extreme, it's the most intense, it's the most sort of impactful. Evocative, I think, is probably a good word. What do you think, Nat? I'm assuming you've had that beer and you know that beer.
I have visited twice, and yes, both times, just fantastic experiences. It is that proper taste of history. And it's that thing where we say, all beer may have had a taste of this in the past, and this is our chance to experience that today. So really wonderful
Yeah.
opportunity. All right, I'm going to throw two last quick questions at you. One is really just, I think, an opportunity for you to promote your book. So David asked, you seem to have missed out the part about Carlsberg's role in the history of brewing,
Mhm.
and there is so much of that in your book. So I know you can't go into a ton of detail today, but any little teaser you want to share with David about that, and then I'll throw one last question at you before we wrap.
Yeah, so Carlsberg, I talk about the great grandfathers of lager in the book, and Pilsner Urquell is one of them. Um, Sedlmayr is one of them. Spartan and the Carlsberg is certainly one of them. They're incredibly central. And actually, that picture I showed you of the three guys standing next to each other, the brewery next to it, that's where um, Jakobsen of Carlsberg got his yeast. So he traveled all the way from Carlsberg by horse and cart to that brewery right there that we saw the picture of. And he got yeast, put it in a hat box with ice or somehow to keep it cold. He took that back to Copenhagen and used that to brew his first lagers. So yeah, incredibly significant. And there's a whole chapter about it in my lager book.
Nice one. Okay, last question, then we'll wrap. Jess and Frank asked a very similar question. Where do you see lager heading in the near and distant future?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's going in two directions. I think one is we're always going to continue to look backwards and to look at classics. I think lagers are very hard to brew. There's nowhere to hide in them. You have to be very precise in your processes, and have to have great ingredients, great quality control. And I think there's a challenge there for every brewer who wants to try and make a perfect Helles, because you can go to Munich, you can go to Augustina, and you could drink that lager that's on the screen, and it's absolute perfection. But can they make that themselves? And I think a lot of brewers kind of want to give that a go. There's also this heritage of lager recipes and this great diversity of lager styles that brewers want to share with the world. So there are loads of lagers that you can only find in Germany, but not everyone can go to Germany. And there are brewers all around the world that want to recreate those to share with their consumers. But then there's also this modern evolution and I guess there's this modern flavor palette for beer right now, which is typically quite dry, but also wants a lot of hop flavor. So I think we're seeing this perfect intersection of amazing hop flavor and amazing hop character with the crisp drinkability of lager. So I think, yeah, it's incredibly exciting where the potential is for lager. And the more I travel, the last time I was in the US, I saw so many more lagers than I'd seen before, and it continues to grow over there. And likewise in Germany, we're seeing more variety and more diversity towards those modern styles, which is very cool.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who has joined us. Thank you for all of your insights, Mark. There were a few additional questions we weren't able to get to just because of timing, but you've got Mark's details there on the slides. You've got his website, so I'm sure he'd welcome you contacting him there with any questions. We've just launched a feedback poll. Please do share your thoughts on the session. As a reminder, the recording will be emailed to you, and it will also be up on the WSET Global Events Hub should you want to watch it back, share it with a friend. And if you would like to learn more about our beer qualifications, head to wsetglobal.com/qualifications, and you'll find everything you need to know there. So thanks for joining us from wherever you have joined today. It's wonderful to see such global representation. And who's thirsty for a lager? I know I certainly am. So thank you so much, Mark. It's been a really wonderful session.
Yeah, thank you very much.